Hi, everybody. It's Jim Ostrowski. I'm with the Liberty Moving podcast. I'm going live today. I know I don't have a huge audience yet, but I'm trying to play around with all this stuff and see what works. I'm not going to be long today. I want to talk about the Trump impeachment, which means I'm not going to be long. This impeachment was a total crock. Um, Basically, the guy gave a speech and they didn't like the contents of the speech. And there was a huge audience down there at Trump's speech. I actually know, I had a guy there who was texting me some photos. He said it was a gigantic crowd. I've seen some of the video, some of the photos, and it looked like a gigantic crowd. They're obviously not going to give him credit for the size of the crowd, but the reason why the size of the crowd matters, I really only saw, I don't know, 1,000 people inside the Capitol. There were more outside. How many people were at the speech? There were a couple 100,000, maybe at least 100,000. So, a very small number of people who attended the speech actually got inside the Capitol. None of this was developed because they did a rush job in impeachment in the House. They didn't do any investigation at all, and that's indicative of the political nature of it all. And then the real purpose. This has been pointed out, and I agree that it was such a sham impeachment that had no legal basis. So what was the point of it? It was really, I think, I agree with the commentators who say this is really just to attack the people who supported Trump and label everybody in the Trump orbit as some sort of a terrorist. Now they've been calling it an insurrection, and I pointed out on Facebook. So a very strange insurrection. The only insurrection in human history I'm aware of where they didn't bring any weapons. Usually, when you have an insurrection, you bring weapons. And what's also an anomaly is that the American right wing, which is roughly speaking pro-Trump, with some exceptions, is the most heavily armed group of citizens in human history. And I know this because I wrote a book called The Second Amendment Works, and I looked at all the statistics on gun ownership in the United States, and our level of gun ownership is far higher than any other country. And let's face it, we know who inside the United States has guns. Left progressives very often do not, although some of them do. And quote, right-wing people, and I hate the term right-wing because what exactly does it mean? So I use it in quotes. Or pro-Trump people tend to be heavily armed. You know this because people in rural areas tend to be heavily armed. And I've studied massive amounts of data on who voted for Trump, and his support in rural areas is very strong. So it wasn't an insurrection. We still don't really know exactly what happened. Is there a timeline? Has there been an investigation? Have people identified who were the key players in getting this thing started? One of the things I noticed early on that day was that the Capitol was barricaded. Now, nobody's pointed out the fact that in and of itself was a provocation. Why? I mean, the Congress is debating this critical issue of who the next president's going to be, and it's completely locked up. It's locked up because of the lockdown. Now, if you're for the lockdown, you say, well, of course it's locked up, but I'm not for the lockdown. I think the lockdown is failed and is not scientifically justified. So, consider the fact that if there had been at least a few people allowed into the gallery. There's hardly any scrutiny of politicians, and when they're allowed to operate without anybody around, and granted, there's video, we all know that, but it's a little different when there's a live audience there. That has an effect, and I think that the fact that people were shut out was actually a provocation here. So, as far as the merits of the impeachment itself, my understanding, I read the articles of impeachment. He was basically charged with giving a speech, the contents of which the impeachment managers and basically the entire Democratic Party, apparently in the whole country, didn't agree with. So what I pointed out on Facebook, and by the way, I'm a constitutional lawyer, and I wrote a book on impeachment of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. So I'm not just blowing smoke in your face. I know a little bit about these things. So the way I've characterized this bogus impeachment is that basically Trump was being impeached for a thought crime. What's the thought crime? He didn't believe the election was fairly administered. And again, I obviously, my avatar is a dove with an olive branch. I believe in peaceful, legal, direct citizen action. I think that if this was done by pro-Trump people, it was a catastrophic miscalculation, and it was wrong. And yes, some people got hurt. They're kind of lying about who got hurt and how and why, and they're of course, mainstream media's lies constantly. They're not telling the truth about exactly what happened. Where's the autopsy report of the officer who died? But certainly not anything that I would have approved of or recommended, as anybody who's read my books knows. And the thing really tremendously backfired. This was an occasion where, for the first time really ever, Trump and his supporters were going to get an opportunity to at least delineate what their objections were to the electoral process. And some of that may have been more along the lines of, there was a lack of uniformity of who could vote, and that violates the Constitution. It's somewhat of a fairly conservative argument that doesn't really allege, misdeeds in terms of the count. But I think also some of the people would have laid out some more intentional sort of wrongdoing that rises above the level of, I'm not saying the Constitution is a technicality, but, people voted, and to say that people voted who shouldn't have voted because the standards used in one state were different from the standards of another state is a little different from saying that there was actual fraud, or people voted who shouldn't have been able, just weren't really eligible to vote, or people voted twice or whatever. But I have never, my position on the propriety of the election has always been that I wanted to have all of the allegations aired out. And even if they were frivolous allegations, they should have been aired out. Now, doesn't what happened on January 6th kind of bear that out? Wasn't there some, I'm not justifying what happened, but just like, a homicide detective looking at a dead body, I'm trying to figure out what happened here. What was the motive? What were the circumstances? And I think what really hurt the country, frankly, was when a number of states in the United States, I know this has all been lost to the sands of time, and I refer to the United States as the United State, the progressive state of America, state meaning singular. But the fact of the matter is that the United States was created by the states, and that's still the case. And if you look at the Constitution, you'll see that the states ratify the Constitution. The states can amend the Constitution. The states could abolish the Constitution even if you're Abraham Lincoln, you would have to concede that if 38 states passed an amendment saying the United States is hereby abolished and we're reverting back to the Articles of Confederation, they certainly have the power to do that. So when a large number of states, including Texas, which is the second largest state, petitioned the Supreme Court to hear this, and the Supreme Court issued some bizarre, like 2-paragraph order that made no sense, that was kind of disrespecting the large number of people who wanted these issues aired out. And I think if the Supreme Court had taken the case, and I've explained elsewhere that one of the reasons I don't think they took the case is they didn't know what to do with it, like as a practical matter. And frankly, not that hard. They should have appointed a special master and gone from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., taking testimony. He or she issues a report. Supreme Court reads the report and votes on it, up or down. And if they had taken the damn case and taken these allegations seriously, we wouldn't have had the damn riot. But that's somewhat beside the point for the purposes of impeachment. The bottom line is the man, and this is why the impeachment was so dangerous and so insidious and really a threat to all of our rights. The guy gave a damn speech. He gave a speech, and they're impeaching him for it. And so the whole thing was completely frivolous. And I know that, it's very hard for Trump to hire lawyers anymore because all of his lawyers get doxxed. And I know it wasn't really the first string or the second string. It was really kind of the third string of lawyers. And I'm not insulting these guys. These guys are good lawyers. They're just thrown into a situation that was impossible to prepare for in that short a period of time. I didn't even watch most of the trial because it was so stupid and boring. And I'm usually riveted to this stuff because I have to comment on it, but it was so stupid. But I did watch the day that the Trump lawyers put on their case, and they did it in a very short period of time. They were very effective. And the idiotic mainstream media kept saying they didn't use all of their time. And Professor Dershowitz got on and very wisely stated something that all veteran litigators know, is that a lot of lawyers, babble on after they've made their point. I mean, I've filed like 10-page briefs in opposition to 50-page briefs and won because I said everything that needed to be said. And I've given some very short oral arguments and won. When you made your case, you sit down and shut up. And that's what they did. They were very effective, and they by all consensus of anybody who knows what they're talking about, blew them out of the water. So it basically, again, they impeached Trump because of he gave a speech, free speech. He did not recommend that anybody do anything illegal, and the Trump lawyers effectively pointed out that they distorted the evidence. They basically lied about it. And I'm not going to go through all the details because you know that. But one of the things that I would have argued, and I wrote a little memo on it, and I won't say what I did with the memo, but suffice it to say, when you try to filter advice into any sort of large organization, it's like trying to assault a castle and they're throwing the hot oil down on you. But so I actually took the position that not only was the impeachment frivolous, but it might actually have been criminal, because under 18 U.S.C. 241, 242, it's actually a crime to interfere with somebody's exercise of their constitutional rights. And certainly exercising your right of free speech is one of those rights. So How did they? So, I mean, I do a lot of First Amendment retaliation work, which is mostly civil, but keep in mind that any violation of the Constitution by an official, and I believe that includes federal officials, certainly includes state official, but I did see a case on it the other day where a federal official was prosecuted, um, can also be considered a crime. And what concerned me the most was statements that were made where, they I know they didn't think that Trump would do this, but they were threatening Trump to to leave office or will impeach you. So that type of threat, I always advise people, by the way, in my law practice, never threaten anybody for any reason, ever, because sometimes threats can be considered illegal. My philosophy is I never threaten anybody. I just do it. So that's a point I would have made. I also, frankly, I know this was not done, but I think that the articles of impeachment put into issue Trump's allegations about the election. And frankly, I would have used it as an opportunity, not to show that, oh, I would have won, but I would have taken some of my best objections to the election and put that into evidence. Why not? And I was going to say before that I call it a riot. It wasn't an insurrection. It's total nonsense. Again, if the right wing wanted to have an insurrection, they would have showed up with a couple 100,000 people with guns, which is certainly capable of doing. They didn't do it. They've chosen to keep the powder dry. Let's face it. So in my view, the threatening Trump with these proceedings could have been considered criminal under 18 U.S.C. 241, 242, and there's also a statute, 18 U.S.C. 372, conspiracy to impede or injure an officer. And that basically talks about people conspiring to interfere with an officer in the discharge of his duties. And again, by threatening Trump, by telling Trump that if you don't resign, we're going to impeach you, that arguably could be considered criminal. So I think really the fact that, just to sum up, the whole thing was obviously nonsense, and the insurrection that went home at 8 p.m. So the whole thing was nonsense, and I really think I've always been resistant to the notion that left progressivism is a mental illness. But frankly, as time goes on, they are acting more and more loony. They made complete fools of themselves, and if they wanted to drive a stake through Trump's heart, they actually, I think it backfired, because I think Trump was hurt by this episode. But the fact that the impeachment trial allowed his lawyers to explain that all he did was ask people to go to the Capitol, which they have a First Amendment right to do, even with the barricades, and petition the government for a redress of grievances. I think actually Trump comes out of this with almost more sympathy, more understanding of his speech than he did just a few weeks ago. So that's basically my thought on the impeachment, and I'm going to be back with another podcast. I'm going to talk about actually the book that's behind me, because, as I said in a previous podcast, you don't really want to hear me do a daily podcast about how crazy and evil the Democrats are and how they're screwing up the country. We're already seeing, manifestations of their idiotic policies. That's all like sort of super obvious and really kind of boring. I'm going to go back and go through the various books I've written, which kind of are a systematic formulation of libertarian thought and practice and ultimately strategy. And I think that'll be a more useful exercise, but I will have occasional podcasts commenting on the critical issues of the day, such as the idiotic Trump impeachment. So over and out for the Liberty Moving podcast.